Anyway, welcome to the final session of our 2016 Lyceum Summer School. The Lyceum is a place of philosophical and theological reflection, so we aim to engage issues that face the Christian in the world today, try to think about how we might better live in the world as Christian believers and how we might be able to respond and engage the world and our colleagues in particular. So today's our final session, so there could be cheers or groans depending on how you felt about the week. But we're looking today at the issue of suffering. Now the issue of suffering is, in our world, is a challenging issue for Christian believers, and it's also a major barrier to belief for many. Many years ago, I used to live in Sydney, and I had a conversation at a shopping centre there once. I was sitting down on a bench preparing Bible study, and this woman came up and sat next to me. I'd never met her or talked to her before, and she asked me, "Oh, you're a Christian?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." And she said, "Oh, I couldn't believe in God." Before I could respond or say anything to her, the very first thing she said was, "Oh, I couldn't believe in God. There's too much suffering in the world." Then I didn't really have a chance to say or anything really in response. But to her, suffering was a defeater belief in God. And certainly at her age, she must have experienced and seen some suffering herself personally. Now, Bart Ehrman is a popular New Testament scholar who's written many books criticising the Christian, Orthodox Christian message, like, for example, misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why. Now, his works are very popular amongst atheists and skeptics who want to criticise and demonstrate the inaccuracy of the Bible, which we would say is not inaccurate, and I refer to our discussion on Monday, which you can look at to understand that more. But a lot of atheists love to share Ehrman's story of deconversion from a committed evangelical to an agnostic. But it's very interesting that Ehrman himself admits that it wasn't his New Testament scholarship on the historical reliability of the Gospels that prompted his deconversion. He admits that it was actually the problem of evil and suffering. He couldn't reconcile a good God with the suffering and the evil that he observes in the world. So this issue of suffering in our world is a very real and a very challenging issue for Christian believers. It's a massive intellectual and experiential or existential barrier to faith to many. So that's what we're going to look at today, is to spend a bit of time thinking about this problem and thinking about some ways. And I'm going to propose it may be maybe not so fresh to some, but it's a somewhat fresh way of responding to this age-old problem. And the logical problem of evil is an ancient problem. It goes back, in fact, to the Greek philosopher Epicurus, who lived a couple of hundred years BC. The problem is in the form of an argument. It's a series of propositions, and it's usually framed like this, and you've got it in your outlines there. First, God is all-powerful. Second, God is all-loving. Third, evil exists in a world created by this God. Now, if God is all-powerful, then he could eliminate evil. If God is all-loving, then he would eliminate all evil. However, since evil exists in this world, it must mean that God is not either all-powerful or all-loving. God must be impotent, wicked, or imaginary. Impotent in that he can't eliminate it, wicked because he allows evil, and then or imaginary because he's actually not there at all. So do you see the problem? Do you appreciate the difficulty? For me, it wasn't a particular problem until I think I appreciated this only a few years ago, the specifics of this particular problem. So the question is, well, how then do we respond? How do we solve the problem? Or can we solve the problem? Well, many have seen that the problem of evil, a number have argued that the problem of evil is actually an argument for atheism. That the world is broken and actually it shows that God doesn't actually there and he's actually imaginary. But the problem with this is that the problem of evil assumes that God is there for there to be a problem. Now, I'll explain just a little bit how that works. So, for example, if atheism is true, then there is actually no problem to solve. Because atheism fails at the rational level. Because for suffering, the presence of evil actually gives us an intellectual argument against naturalism or against atheism, and even for the existence of God. Now, C.S. Lewis was once a very committed atheist who admitted that he felt the force of the argument of suffering for atheism, for an imaginary God. He said, Had God designed the world, it would not be a world so frail and faulty as we see. Yet Lewis recognised that this argument against God contained the seeds of its own subversion. He wrote this, he said, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust, but how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line." I'm not sure if you're following exactly what's going on here, but we can talk about it more in the question time if you like. But if you want to say that something is evil, then you must have some kind of reference, something to compare it to. You must have the concept of a straight line. So the issue becomes acute when you consider something like, say, bone cancer in children. Atheists really shouldn't have a problem with bone cancer in children, should they? Because the universe doesn't care. There's no design, no purpose, no good, no evil, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So if one clump of cells happen to be cancerous and cause a painful physiological reaction, well, what does DNA care? What does evolution care? What does the universe care? It says nothing. There is nothing, no reference to say, this is wrong. There's nowhere written, this is evil. See, atheism doesn't solve the problem of evil. Because with atheism there is no problem to solve. There just is. Some people get lucky, other kids get bone cancer, and that's just kind of the way it is. So the problem is, as soon as you start saying that something is wrong or evil, then atheism has the problem. It's the problem of good. Where does that good reference, the idea of the straight, come from? If atheism is true, then nothing is objectively wrong. As soon as we say something is evil, then atheism is undermined. So the attempt to solve the problem of evil has occupied philosophers for centuries. And so so the idea that God is somehow rendered imaginary by the problem of evil fails at the rational level, precisely for the reason that I've just outlined. So that means that the attempts to solve it have occupied philosophers for a long time, and many have attempted to resolve the intellectual problem of evil. Now, I read a book a couple of years ago called True Reason, which was written in response to the Reason Rally organised in Washington in 2012. Now, chapter 14 of the book, it was written by a philosopher by the name of John DePoe that dealt with the problem of evil. The chapter was entitled The Problem of Evil and Reasonable Christian Responses. Now, his chapter was coherently written and gave a philosophically sound response. And he proposed two philosophically reasonable reasons for why God permits evil. And I think they're on your outline there, which says, evil is necessary for character development, and evil is necessary for free will. So his response revolved around two philosophical concepts which can be observed without reference to the Bible or anything else. And to some extent they are contained within the Bible, but they can be observed without that. They're philosophical. So for example, the idea that evil is necessary for character development. It's a common experience of our life, isn't it? I'm sure that we'd say that we're all the better for periods of suffering or difficulty in our lives, wouldn't we? So much so that the great German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said that which does not kill us makes us stronger. So we are better people for having suffered. We are more resilient, more patient, more empathetic, more determined, and stronger. The second philosophical defence that DePoe refers to is the free will defence. This is different to the Free Willy defence. That was a 90s movie, which I don't think was very good, but free will is very different to Free Willy. But the free will defence is that what makes it possible for people to be morally good or evil. You can't, the philosophers argue, have good or evil without a choice. And this has been made famous by philosopher Alvin Plantinga. So the world in which there is suffering is therefore the best of all possible worlds. Now, there are many philosophers in the world today who actually claim that the free will defence solves the problem, that it actually works. It does provide a philosophical solution to the problem of evil, as it's been described. But anyway, I read this chapter, and as I said, it was well written and provided some helpful food for thought. Yet I felt that there were a couple of large problems with DePoe's approach. Now, I don't mean to pick on DePoe specifically, I'm just using this as an example to highlight the weaknesses of his method. So this is a methodological observation rather than picking on John DePoe because he's no good. I think he's a very, very fine philosopher, a very fine Christian man, I'm sure. The key question going through my head was, are these responses biblical? Depew hardly mentioned the Bible at all as he was outlining, ironically, his reasonable Christian response. It felt more philosophical than Christian. Now, there's some merit to what he suggests. God indeed has given people freedom, and God indeed uses suffering to build character. There's Bible passages which we can point to for that. But the key aspect of why this defense fails is that evil somehow becomes necessary, or even a good. One response to Depew's argument, well, how much suffering does God need to permit to make it justifiable? It's unclear how much suffering becomes necessary. I think we always need to maintain and share and believe that evil is always evil and suffering is always suffering, and that they're always wrong, that they're not necessary to make them a good. Similarly, or further, moreover, some suffering seems disproportionate and unrelated to human will. And so the problem doesn't have any easy answers at all. But my biggest problem, which is this was the main symptom of, was that his starting point was that of philosophy, not of revelation. If we do philosophy divorced from revelation, we might make guesses, but we can't really know. How do you know anything about anybody? Well, you can make some guesses, we can do some experiments, we can make some good guesses, but we don't. The only way we can really know is if someone tells us. So I think we get a more biblically nuanced view on suffering if we actually started from revelation, informed by philosophy. It's important. I'm not saying philosophy isn't important at all. But rather, why not start from revelation, being informed by philosophy rather than the other way around. So I've been convinced that revelation in the end becomes the best apology, or the best defense of the Christian message. In my debates and discussions with atheists and skeptics, the question constantly arises, how do you know God's really there? Or how do you know that your God is true? The answer doesn't come primarily through philosophy or natural theology, which is theology without revelation. Though that can and should incorporate that into our responses. It's a very valuable part of the Christian theology or understanding of the world. But the primary answer must come through revelation. As a result of this, Jesus must be the heart of any genuinely Christian apologetic. Apologetics can be technical and philosophical, but sometimes I think it can miss the point. An apologetic must ultimately end up in Jesus. Why? Because Jesus is the primary way in which we know God. John 1:18 says, no one has ever seen God. But God, the one and only, who's actually a reference for Jesus at that particular point, who is at the Father's side, has made him known. So that's a crucial word, has made him known. So when we ask, how do you know God's there? How do I know about God? Well, ultimately it's because Jesus has made him known. This is crucial. So, I did a debate last year with an atheist on, is God really there? And I was using this as my philosophy and say, actually, ultimately, how do I know God's there? I know God's there because he's been here. And that's the best way. I think it's and it means that for a number of reasons, it's actually a really good reason. So I think when we want to understand God most fully, we look to Jesus because he has made him known. The argument from Revelation is the strongest argument, I think, for theism. And so because Jesus reveals God, I believe Christian apologetics must have its centre in Jesus, in Christ. It's hard to defend the Christian message of Jesus as Lord and Saviour if I never even get to Jesus. Now, I'm a member of many online apologetics groups, and I constantly see Christians sharing the opportunities they have to speak about the existence of God, etc. And they're all asking, is the moral argument the best, or the cosmological argument, or the argument from contingency, etc., etc., the first cause? They're all fine arguments, and they have a place. But I think that this approach means that you actually get to Jesus and the gospel far too slowly, if ever at all. It becomes a philosophical discussion rather than one of a Christian discussion. And I think, in my view, it's a mistake. In my view, the argument from Revelation is the strongest argument for theism. Tim Keller captures this in his recent book, Encounters with Jesus. Someone once asked him, why can't you give me a watertight argument for the existence of God? And Keller responds quite brilliantly when he says, what if God didn't send us a watertight argument, but a watertight person against Jesus Christ, against whom in the end there can be no argument? Jesus comes to be the answer to our deep questions. And I think Keller is dead right. We need to be confident in the argument from Revelation. We need to be confident that this is the most powerful argument for not only the existence of God, but the best way to understand the nature of God. So I think apologetics should have its starting point in Revelation. Not only is the best place to know that God's there, but it's also the best way that we know anything about him. So I think that our evangelism and our apologetics should revolve around revelation before philosophy. Our apologetics should include philosophy and have an understanding of philosophy. I think philosophy is essential, but we need to get to revelation, otherwise I don't think our apologetics is genuinely Christian. So, a fresh way of engaging the problem of evil is to consider revelation. Why not explore how God solves suffering as he has been revealed to us? How could a loving and powerful God allow pain and suffering in the world? Well, why not consider how Jesus, the Word became flesh, approaches suffering himself and how he encounters it. Jesus versus suffering. Now, we haven't got time in this session to explore all the ways in which Jesus helps us nuance the problem of evil. I found it an enormously helpful experiment to read through a gospel. I just chose Matthew because it was the first one there, and I lack imagination to try any further. So I just went, read through Matthew and just read through and wrote down all the references to suffering, all the different types of suffering there was, all the references there were, Jesus' approach to it, the way he saw it, the way the gospel author saw it, etc. And it was a fascinating experiment. There was a number of new insights and things that I gleaned, and I'm going to share one of those particular ones right now. There's a number of patterns and insights which I discovered and saw. And one of them was in reading of Matthew chapter 8. So at the beginning of Matthew 8, it says, "When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him." Now here, Jesus is confronted with a form of evil, natural evil, isn't he? This is evil which has nothing to do with the actions of humans. A man with leprosy. Now there's no specific reason given for his suffering. It's just there. Suffering is a part of the world that Jesus encounters. It's not because of karma. It's not because he's made some bad decisions. It's not because he's being punished. This passage makes no attempt to explore why is he like this. It just acknowledges that this is the world that we live in, the world that we have. Whether this is the best of all possible worlds, there's no philosophical reflection. This is just the reality of this world. And the world is not right. The Bible acknowledges this. And so, interestingly, suffering is not a surprise to Jesus. Jesus enters a world with evil and suffering. He encounters a world with things like bone cancer and leprosy. And God himself, in Jesus, is confronted with this problem. And how does he respond? Well, the leper approaches Jesus and asks a question. "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Now this is the problem of evil, isn't it? A loving God would want to eliminate evil. "Lord, if you are willing." A loving God has the power to eliminate evil. "You can make me clean." Do you see that? When I read through this, I was astonished to find the problem of evil is actually in the gospel. So the leper highlights the issue in his very simple question. It's almost as if the leper himself had pondered the problem of evil in his life. Are you able? Are you willing? Now what's really interesting is that the leper assumes Jesus' power, but questions his goodness. I wonder if this is because this is the natural response to suffering. C.S. Lewis explores this question in A Grief Observed. He writes, these are writings he penned in the days after the death of his wife. You can feel, if you've ever read it, you can feel the raw emotion and pain in his words and as he cries out saying, "What reason have we, except in our own desperate wishes, to believe that God is good? Doesn't all the prima facie evidence suggest exactly the opposite?" So God, this is the words of the leper, "Are you willing to make me clean? Are you good?" And then look at the next verse. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man, saying, "I am willing." He said, "Be clean." And immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. And here, the problem of evil becomes problematic. Jesus says, I am willing. He does have the power to overcome suffering, but he also has the desire. He willingly heals. It's almost, again, as though Matthew, the author, is acutely aware of the philosophical problem of evil. Is Jesus able to alleviate this man's suffering? Is he willing to alleviate this man's suffering? And the answer to both is yes. Yes, he is. So what does this then mean? Well, notice that Jesus, the God-man, doesn't disappear in a puff of philosophical logic. The philosophical response must be that God has a reason for allowing suffering or natural evil, because it's far too simple just to say that the presence of evil renders God evil or impotent. We see God in Jesus confronted with suffering, and he deals with it. He cures the leper. So what then is the reason that God has? What is the reason that God has for allowing evil? Well, this is going to the very heart of the problem of evil. Because the problem of evil is really more specifically about the problem of the origin of evil. If an all-powerful and all-loving God creates a universe, what role could evil and pain and suffering have in that? It goes right back to the very beginning. And the best way, what's the best way of answering that question? How do we know what role God has had? Well, if he tells you. And the problem that we have is that God has never told us. There are some things that remain hidden. So, as I said, when I was reading through Matthew, looking for the issue of evil, the problem of suffering, Matthew 13:35 speaks of things being hidden since the creation of the world being revealed. Jesus speaks in parable to reveal some things, but perhaps not everything. It's like Deuteronomy 29:29, where the secret things belong to God. Now this makes us humble. Somewhat frustrated, perhaps. We'd like to know the answer to everything, but it also makes us humble. Because there is an assumption that if God has good reasons for suffering, then we should know what those reasons are. But perhaps we're just not told. Now, I'm suspicious of any Christian or any person who claims to have solved the problem of evil. Because the problem of evil is really about the problem of the origin of evil, and I'm not sure that we have a completely clear solution. For example, I've heard some say that there is evil in the world simply because we have chosen evil. We have rejected God, for example, in the garden, and evil is punishment for this. Now, there's an element to which this is true, and I acknowledge this. We do live estranged from God and his grace and his blessing to us. But this doesn't explain why God allowed us to make a choice in the first place if it was going to be so bad. Or why did God allow Eve to listen to the serpent? Or why was the serpent even in God's good garden in the first place? Who created the serpent? So with the problem of evil, we need to think, we need to read the Bible, but also be humble. We don't know everything there is to know about God. Now this may seem unsatisfying to some, but if we look forward, the problem will be resolved. So if we read through Matthew, for the first 16 chapters, we see that Jesus confronts evil and suffering on virtually every page. He heals the sick, cures lepers, brings relief to a world of suffering, the world that we inhabit, the world that they inhabited back then. Yet after Peter's confession that Jesus is the Christ in 16:16, suddenly we learn that there's a pivot and it switches, and suddenly we learn that Jesus himself will suffer. Matthew 16:21. Jesus himself would suffer and die. The one who overcomes suffering, the Messiah, would suffer himself, the suffering servant. Hence, a persuasive reason to believe God to be good and all-powerful is because he lovingly and willingly suffered for his people. Jesus Christ, God incarnate, God become man, Jesus, who suffered for his people. He suffered a painful, unjust death. So if we consider the crucifixion of Jesus, the God-man, dying there, suffering, we ask, where was God in the story of the crucifixion? The answer is right at the heart of it. Because in his death on the cross, Jesus reveals his goodness and his power. Because on the cross, he provides forgiveness for his people. Jesus dies our death. He suffers for us and brings reconciliation and forgiveness. Which is ironic, that through the suffering of Jesus, the suffering of God, it reveals his goodness and his power. God is good and he is not removed from our suffering. Jesus, the God-man, lovingly dies for his people. Now, we're not always sure why there's evil and suffering, but when we see Jesus' death on the cross, we must realise that it's not inconsistent with an all-powerful, all-loving God. The one who confronts evil, the one who experienced evil, the one who cried out those pained words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" God has used suffering, but is he good? Well, at the cross, we can see that whatever we think about God, it can't be that he doesn't love us. His goodness is seen in his own suffering on the cross. I do wonder, I've pondered if God could have shown or demonstrated his love to us in any other way. Could God have demonstrated his love without creating a world with suffering? It's a question that I've pondered. It may be one of the reasons that God has allowed a world of pain and suffering to demonstrate his love for us. I can't prove it, but it's a potential idea. We suffer, yes, but God himself has suffered to put an end to suffering, which gives us hope. And hope is the key distinctive in any Christian apologetic. We have hope that suffering will indeed end. And I don't think that a Christian apologetic is complete on suffering is complete unless we talk about hope. Jesus just didn't suffer and die to demonstrate that that the suffering isn't incompatible with his existence and to demonstrate that the problem of evil isn't actually a problem. After suffering, he conquered death to be raised to new life and now offers hope. Hope of a new deathless world, free from pain, tears, or suffering. Now, atheists and secularists hope for a better world, but this hope is pretty vague to a starving African child or to the poor 11-year-old child, a friend of our family who died last week. What hope do atheists have for these poor children? Removing God removes any sense of personal future hope. But with Jesus there is a sure and a certain hope. Hope of a world without suffering, pain or death. Revelation 21 speaks about a new world, the world of the future, the world of the resurrection, where God will be with us and he will wipe away every tear from our eyes. There'll be no more suffering or mourning or crying or pain. There'll be no more suffering, no more evil. So if you extinguish God, you extinguish hope. Suffering is painful, suffering hurts. Sometimes there are obvious and clear reasons for our suffering. Sometimes these reasons are obscure. We may not fully understand why there's suffering and evil in our world. We aren't able to explain it all, but the hope of the gospel and the hope of the Christian message is that suffering will end. Jesus' suffering, his death and then resurrection heralds a new age where suffering will not rule. He suffers so that we may no longer suffer. This means that ultimately, the problem of evil is solved. A good God has done something about the evil in the world. He sent his son to die and he's raised up to bring us hope. So let's go back to the original issues with the problem of evil. If God is all-powerful, then he could eliminate evil. If God is all-loving, then he would eliminate evil. In Jesus, through the cross and the hope of heaven, he has and he will eliminate evil. He triumphs over it. So as Christian believers, we look forward to that great day when there will be no more pain, tears or death, and we can pray and cry out, "Come, Lord Jesus, and bring that day when the problem of evil is finally solved." May that day come soon. Now, as we talk about this issue in the office, it can obviously be a very difficult and personal one. And it's for some, as like the woman that I shared at the beginning, suffering may not necessarily be an intellectual objection, but an existential one. And when we speak with our colleagues and with objectors, the first thing that we need to do is to distinguish whether the suffering or the objection is the result of personal experience or because it's an intellectual problem. So one of the ways you do that, I think one of your one-liners, or one of the questions you need to ask, the very first question, someone says, "I don't believe this, God to be suffering." You ask, why do you ask? Why is that? Because you don't want to have to outline a whole series of the critique of the intellectual problem of evil, or say, "Oh, you're an atheist because therefore you actually haven't got a problem at all," etc., etc. When they say it's because my mum died of cancer, or because of these other personal reasons, and you can actually then open up a very, very different conversation. And if you have talked about that in the past with someone, I've heard a story of someone who did basically go for an intellectual answer when they really were suffering deeply themselves, and had to go back and apologise to that person and say, look, I'm so sorry. I didn't realise who you were, what your situation was. That was insensitive and wrong. So if we are dealing with the experiential problem, I think the key thing is just to listen, to be there for them, care, and say less. And I think that will speak far more than being able to provide a robust solution to the problem of evil. But a few little questions you can ask. If their issue is intellectual, and for people like Bart Ehrman, it seems that's primarily intellectual, you could ask questions like, I think in the debates that I did with the atheist last year, he objected, he argued one of his objections was that there's no objective morality, there's no objective right or wrong, which you have to, which is consistent with an atheist perspective. But then he also said, one of the reasons I don't believe in God is the problem of evil. And someone very cleverly asked him, says, but do you believe in evil? Because you can't actually say it's a problem against God if you believe... and so it was interesting, his response. He actually said, no, I don't believe in evil, I just believe in gratuitous suffering. Which I just thought was an odd position to come to. It's a little bit inconsistent if you ask me. But do you believe in evil? I think is an interesting question to ask people. Particularly to the atheist who says X is wrong. And then you want to go back to an infinite regress. You want to get them back to say, well, who says? Well, who says? Well, who says? Because in the end, you're going to have to say, I think in my view, that it will only come to the person who's most powerful. So that's who has the most power. In the end, that's the atheistic morality. That in the end, it's just simply who... You can't say something is just wrong, because because you have to ground it in something. And otherwise you say, who says, who says, who says? Ultimately, it's just the people who have the most power. You could also ask yourself, I don't believe in God because of suffering. You can't have a world like that. So have you ever benefited from suffering? Have you ever done something where you actually have suffered, but you feel like you're a better person as a result? I think that just gives your way of just getting people a little bit off guard, thinking, yeah, I have. Well, so you actually don't have a problem with all suffering then, do you? Because some suffering is actually beneficial. You could ask, well, what would a good God do about suffering? If God was a good God, what would a good God then do about suffering? And then perhaps because you want to get to drive to hope, and I think like a question you could ask is, would it be good news if suffering would one day end? And if you get them to say yes to that, then I think you've won half the battle, because you could say, let me show you Revelation 21. Isn't that good news? Would that be worthwhile? Do you think that might have some credibility? Yeah. Anyway, well, thanks for listening, I suppose, and taking notes. Any questions, or comments, or things to add, or fiery criticism? Because if you have fiery criticism, then it's time to finish up. Yeah. No. So we want to have an open forum of discussion and sharing ideas. So anyone have any questions or comments? Jenny, yeah.
Yeah, look, I've really enjoyed that, Rob. I found it enormously helpful. So thank you.
I'm glad that. Yes, that's right. Well, there we go. Thanks. Next comments. Next question.
No, I can't start without putting in my 2 cents.
Sure, no, absolutely, of course, yeah.
It strikes me that kind of series of propositions, God is all powerful, God is all loving, there's no sense of that you would ever have a relationship with God. And that fellow that you were talking about who walked away from evangelicalism, the only thing I've concluded is that he never actually knew God. Because I think as a Christian, one of the things that I often talk about with suffering is I'll talk about times in my own life when I've suffered very deeply and how close I've drawn to God in those times. And I think that that's actually quite a powerful... it's quite a powerful apologetic that there's a real relationship that actually sustains you, and you know God far more deeply in times of suffering.
I absolutely agree. That's why, for me, it was never really an issue as a young believer, or as a believer, maybe intermediate believer, or even an advanced believer at different points. It was only when I was at Bible college and I was actually finally confronted with the philosophical problem, and I just thought, well, it's just never really been an issue for me for most of my Christian life, because the Bible acknowledges the world is suffering. I mean, it doesn't necessarily go through as I've outlined today, it doesn't necessarily provide a philosophical reason for why there is, but this is just the way the world is. And we know that, and I think there's good reasons to believe that what Jesus says is true and reliable and trustworthy. And so, and one of the reasons I think I believe the Bible to be true is because it does reflect the world that it is. It doesn't propose a world that is unreasonable or is just unbelievable. It's actually, it seems to accord with our experience, and it helps, and I think you're right, it does help us in those experiences. Yeah, I agree, in times of my life when I've drawn closer to God in suffering, Because I think there's other aspects to the apologetics, and it's partly because I think of his presence and his walking alongside you as well. Yeah. You didn't happen to write that Footprints poem, did you? Was that? Sorry, yeah, I think everyone's trying to work out that.
I think the other thing that I liked about your talk is getting people back to the scriptures as soon as possible.
Absolutely.
Because the Word of God is actually really, really powerful.
Completely,
and it's far more powerful than our stupid arguments.
That's part of my... I mean, I have a broader philosophical... Well, today was partly trying to deal with that, and in some way it was a methodological question, but it's also a... because it has impacts on how you approach certain topics. So, for example, if you want to watch the debate that I did, the opening statement, I think, Aaron, you've seen it, haven't you? And I start with I refer to certain other arguments, which I'm happy to talk about, but if I'm going to get to what's the number one, the money question, the money argument, let's just talk about God who has revealed himself to us and come and lived among us. And to me, that's the most powerful. Because I'm not trying to convince someone, ultimately, the goal of the Christian apologist or the evangelist is not just to convince someone that God's there. You want to convince sinful people to come into relationship with him. And so I think that's why I think using the argument from Revelation, informed by philosophy, certainly, needs to be more prominent. Yeah. Other questions, thoughts, violent disagreement? Yeah. Oh, Andrew, great, violent disagreement coming up.
Yeah. I was going to say it was excellent too. I'm not just saying thanks to my boss, but I
get paid next month.
No, I really do, and you've convinced me of the argument for Revelation, that aspect of things too that Jenny just mentioned. I think is particularly helpful. Just a question / comment.
Yep.
The problem as you outline it there, if God is all powerful, if God is all loving.
Mm-hmm.
What if someone puts that specific scenario equation to me? Is there a way that I can easily pull the rug out from under that? I mean, I think we've talked before about a built-in assumption to that.
Yeah.
That could be worth pointing out.
Well, exactly right. I mean, you could argue, I suppose, from a parent. If you've got a parent who is, good, a parent who's able to control the child's circumstance, will you let your child suffer? Well, there are times when you want to because you want to punish them, or there are other times. I suppose there are times where you think that it's appropriate. It's not a perfect analogy, but I think there's I won't blame that. I mean, another thing also, I would perhaps, I've been influenced by reading Matthew 8 and just saying, well, okay, let's just look at what the Bible says. Well, it's not that you want to go there necessarily, but if they're interested in saying, okay, well, here's the problem. I believe that Jesus was God himself, but it doesn't seem to be a problem for him. And so, and then you could actually, you just want to come back and say, the assumption in this thing is that God has no reason for allowing evil.
So we might say, line 1, I've got no problem with, if God is all powerful, then he'll eliminate evil. But line 2...
Line 2 is the problem.
We're assuming that he would.
Yes.
And that could take us to the cross as well.
Well, it does, and that's what I've tried to point out, that in the end it does. Which means that, and then the Christian gospel actually is a theodicy. It does actually solve the problem of evil in the end. But the question is, why has he allowed us to go through all this pain and suffering in the meantime? I'm not entirely sure I know the answers. But this is what separates Christianity from other worldviews and philosophies, particularly Islam, because we know that God has come and lived and suffered and died among us, which is fundamentally different with Islam, where God is so transcendent that, well, in the end, there's no problem because God can be inconsistent. It's just the will of Allah, and that's kind of the way it is. And we just got to put up with it. But I think we have. It's a fundamentally different way of dealing with it. Does that help?
Yeah.
The question? Because I think the first premise I think is unchallengeable, that God is all powerful. The second one is where you say, well, it assumes that we know the mind of God to say that he would do something. As I said, and that's why using a parent, you say it assumes that any parent would not allow their child to suffer in any way. There are times when I'm very happy to let my children suffer because of a variety of reasons. For a variety of reasons. It's not because I don't love them, not because I have the power to stop them, but it's because it's for their good. This kind of goes back to the argument, the philosophical argument from character development. And I think it's good for them to grow. But I think we can point to that as a way, but I think ultimately you want to get to Revelation and say, well, the only way I can know for certain is if God actually tells me.
And that's helpful, because I think sometimes it can be presented as such a watertight scenario equation that I think for some of us it can really throw us.
That's very helpful. Thanks very much.
The other thing that's the assumption behind it is that we don't deserve to suffer. God owes us.
Yeah.
So maybe another way of putting it back to people is saying, do you think we don't deserve? Nobody ever deserves to suffer. So, or God? Do you think that God owes us?
It does raise another interesting question to the materialist, is to say, well, what actually is suffering? Because some would argue that suffering is an illusion, and that, and as I said, like, just because a pain is a physiological reaction, a painful physiological reaction, is that suffering? Like, that raises a whole bunch of, so that's going to start mess with your mind, particularly fun after about what actually is suffering, and for that it becomes, just because I feel pain, does that mean that I'm suffering? I suppose at one level you could say yes, but it just raises lots of actual, because you need to, in the end, import some sort of value judgment on top of it. If you just want to live it as a materialist world, then it's just physiological reactions reacting against physiological reasons, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. It's like DNA, we dance to its music, and that's what Richard Dawkins says. Yeah. Maybe we probably have to finish up because it's just about time.